Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Lisa Ansell, Associate Director of the USC Casden Institute, and on behalf of the USC Casden Institute and Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion, Los Angeles, I welcome all of you to today's conversation on the topic of 21st century American Jewry, from anti-Semitism to new forms of engagement. Our esteemed panelists, Dr. Sarah Bunin-Benor, Dr. Leah Hochman, Rabbi Noah Farkas, and Jeffrey Abrams, Esquire, will be introduced in greater detail by my colleague and moderator for today's event, Dr. Stephen Windmuller. Suffice it to say that the new anti-Semitism we are witnessing from both the right and the left of the political spectrum, as well as the ways in which Jewish communities have responded to these threats, requires keen analysis. We have seen unprecedented attacks on our community in this last week alone that threaten the fabric of our security as living openly Jewish lives in America. And we thank our panelists for helping us engage in a meaningful conversation about this often polarizing yet highly relevant topic. Now it is my great pleasure to introduce my longtime colleague and friend and guest editor of Volume 19 of the Casden Annual Review, titled The Impact of the Presidency of Donald Trump on American Jewry in Israel, Dr. Stephen Windmuller, Professor Emeritus of Jewish Communal Studies at Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion, and current interim director of the Zelikow School of Jewish Nonprofit Management. Welcome, Stephen.
Thank you so much, Lisa. To help us unpack these extraordinary changes and challenges to American society and to our Jewish communal enterprise, I have invited 4 distinguished guests and special friends to join me in this webinar. As you heard, it is sponsored by the Casden Institute of the University of Southern California and the Hebrew Union College. At the outset, I wish to thank and acknowledge Professor Stephen Ross, the director of the Institute, and Lisa Schneider-Ansell, the associate director, for their leadership and for this invitation. Rabbi Noah Farkas currently serves as the president and CEO of the Jewish Federation of Los Angeles. Prior to his appointment to the Federation, he served Valley Beth Shalom congregation as a member of its clergy team for more than a dozen years. Named by the Forward as one of this nation's most inspiring rabbis, Noah has been actively engaged in the issue of homelessness, as well as other social justice causes. We are indeed privileged to have Rabbi Farkas with us today. Jeffrey Abrams is the Anti-Defamation League's 5th regional director here in the Los Angeles area. A native of the city, Jeffrey is trained as an attorney and mediator who has a long and significant involvement in Jewish, civic, and philanthropic institutions, including his board service with Beit Tzedek Legal Services, the Jewish Federation of Los Angeles, and the Washington Institute. 2 of our panelists are affiliated with the Hebrew Union College as members of the faculty of our Los Angeles campus. Dr. Sarah Bunin-Benor is vice provost and professor of contemporary Jewish studies at HUC and an adjunct professor of linguistics at the University of Southern California. Sarah received her BA from Columbia University and completed her PhD at Stanford. Her extensive and highly regarded writings on American Jewish culture has resulted in her receiving the National Book Award in Education and Jewish Identity. She has also been a winner of distinguished prizes and fellowships as a result of her extraordinary research and publications. Among her varied initiatives, she is the founding co-editor of the Journal of Jewish Languages and co-editor of Languages in Jewish Communities, Past and Present. Dr. Leah Hochman is the Associate Professor of Jewish Thought at Hebrew Union College and also directs the Lockheim School of Judaic Studies at the University of Southern California. Professor Hochman was educated at Pitzer College and holds advanced degrees in religion and literature from Boston University. Prior to coming to the Hebrew Union College in 2008, Leah was an assistant professor at the University of Florida. Currently, Dr. Hochman offers courses in Jewish history, thought, literature, and identity to students both at USC and HUC. In addition, Dr. Hochman is the author of 2 publications. I'm honored to call Dr. Benor and Dr. Hochman my colleagues at HUC-JAR and welcome them along with Rabbi Farkas and Jeffrey Abrams. Let us now move to the issues at hand, and in doing so, invite our audience to share in the chat room in the Q&A section their questions as this conversation unfolds. To begin with, I would like to invite Jeff to begin our conversation with the following sort of reality check. While we readily identify anti-Semitism as very present, and indeed within our own community in just these past few days, why do we think it has been such an accelerated element in our lives? What are some of the key trigger points that we need to understand? So I welcome Jeff to this opportunity.
Thank you, Steve. I appreciate it. And thanks to you and the Casden Institute, USC and HUC for this opportunity. As you said, I think we need to start with the reality check. So the reality check is what occurred this week in our community in the Pico Robertson neighborhood. On Wednesday morning, after leaving his synagogue, a man was shot by a passerby, shot in the back. The following morning, again, a man leaving his synagogue after prayer was shot. This is in my own neighborhood. I live within Beverlywood. I was on the scene Thursday morning. And what quickly unfolded was that a single person was responsible for both of these attacks. Again, deadly attacks on Jews simply exercising their right to express who they were. By Thursday night, law enforcement, LAPD leading the charge with others, an arrest was made of the perpetrator in Cathedral City down in Riverside County, where the perpetrator was found to have the handgun used in the attack, as well as a semi-automatic rifle. By Friday, that person was charged with hate crimes, federal hate crimes, and is now facing life imprisonment for attempted murder and violation of civil rights. That's the reality check of where we are today, here in our city. Now, why are we here? This person just representing one potentially fatal act of a society that seems to be, as you say, accelerating towards more and more anti-Semitism. I'll offer 3 reflections on why, but they're just 3 because there's no simple answer and no single answer. So first, we're living in a time where the conditions are ripe. Think of it sort of a field of hay, dried out grass. And those conditions are a society in turmoil, economic turmoil, COVID turmoil, political turmoil, polarization. And historically, whenever there's that polarization, that anxiety in society, unfortunately, anti-Semitism rears its ugly head. Then there's the propellant. What's actually making these conditions spread like wildfire? What's the gasoline? And in this case, unfortunately, as my colleague Rabbi Farkas has recently said, it's social media. It's an unregulated social media that is designed to promote the most emotionally charged experiences to keep people on their platform. Unregulated spread of hate. Hate used to exist in different hollows and different places in our country in the shadows, but there was no way to connect it. And now we see it's connected. And lastly is the spark. And in this case, the spark is celebrity or prominent people, some of whom, like Ye, formerly known as Kanye West, who have more followers than there are Jews on this planet. And when they demand that Jews be held responsible or that DEFCON 3 is declared on the Jews, make no mistake, it has impact. It sets the fire off. We've seen it here in our city. We just released a study within the last week about the impact of Kanye West's statement. We found over 30 instances around our country, prominent instances of people raising up the idea of Kanye was right about the Jews. So you add all these things together, unfortunately, it's the perfect storm. And we saw it, unfortunately, dramatically clear here in Los Angeles this past week.
Thank you, Jeff, for opening this conversation with the kind of clarity and focus on what is happening and what has happened. Rabbi Farkas, I want to take us to the point of how, as a community, do we best respond?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Wimmuller. Thank you to the Casden Institute, and thanks to all the folks who are watching or viewing now. It's important that we continue to learn and to be informed. And as Jeffrey just said a minute ago, the environment that we're in has created perhaps one of the most anti-Semitic and, in fact, violent anti-Semitic environments in the history of this country. If you just go back a few years, whether it was Charlottesville or Poway or Squirrel Hill or Brooklyn, I mean, these names, these are villages and towns none of us knew before. And now we all know their names because those are all places where Jews were violently assaulted. Colleyville, Texas being the latest one, where a Jew was kidnapped, a whole congregation was held hostage, and of course now back in Los Angeles. What I know about what we can do and what Federation is able to do in partnership with ADL, AJC, a number of others. I'll give you three things also that we need to do. The very first thing we need to do is to make sure that our institutions are secure. Fighting anti-Semitism is a harder thing to do, actually, than fighting anti-Semites. And the way that we fight anti-Semites is to harden the targets. And we've been able to do that through our nonprofit security grant training, our community security initiative that does ethnic sensitivity training for guards at one of the 600 plus Jewish institutions in town, and the monitoring that makes us very closely associated with law enforcement, so that when these crimes do occur, we know immediately and we can take reaction to that. But that's the last policy. That's the last thing that should be standing. We wish there should be 100 things that should happen before that, which leads to the second major thing, to me anyway, is collective action. When Alexis de Tocqueville came to this country from France before America was founded, he found out that democracy is based entirely on the ability to take atomized individuals, bring them together with a collective vision, and create collective power. In this very individualized world that we're in now, where we're all just kind of floating around and the individual has become the supreme arbiter of all things, we have to remember those civic virtues of what democracy means. And we as a Jewish community need to put aside any of our differences. We need to not worry too much about where anti-Semitism is coming from and not get caught up on the taxonomy of a particular definition, and focus on the victims of anti-Semitism, because in all cases, whether it's left or right, the victims are the same, which are you and me. And so that collective action is something that we need to do. And an example of that is the coordinating piece that Federation is hosting with ADL and et cetera, building a anti-Semitism roundtable. Hasn't really existed here in LA before for a very long time, doesn't really exist in many other places, but bringing all the players together to act in a coordinated, multivocal, and collective way is what helps build power. And we're doing that tomorrow night at our town hall, where we'll be hosting tomorrow night in the evening around 5:30. The mayor will be coming, a number of elected officials will be coming, Chief Moore will be coming, and more than hearing from them, it's an opportunity for them to hear from you. And that is what we mean by collective action. When we show up in mass and we show up in force and we fill the gym at ULA, at Yeshiva University, LA's high school for boys, tomorrow night, our elected officials will hear our pain and hear our anger. And then the last thing, which really is really important beyond our security and our collective action together, is our pride in being Jewish. What we know is over the last several years, I think the AJC just came out with this study too, that said 1 in 4 American Jews have changed their behavior because of anti-Semitism. Whether it's removing religious paraphernalia or hiding a star or a chai, or being quiet about their Judaism, or maybe not even going to synagogue or school. I think that the way that we fight anti-Semitism is by not letting anti-Semitism define our Jewish behavior. And the way that we do that is to make sure that we give our kids a joyous Jewish life, that we celebrate Shabbat together, that we celebrate Jewish culture together. So those are the 3 pillars: is security, collective action, and Jewish joy.
Thank you, Rabbi Farkas. Professor Hochman, acknowledging that anti-Semitism is a symptom of other challenges and threats within our society, what role, in your view, ought Jews to be playing within the public square?
Thank you. And I just want to echo my colleagues on the panel. Thank you to the Casden Institute. Thank you to HEC for the co-sponsoring. And it's a really, this could not be a more timely panel. So I'm really grateful to have the opportunity talk about it and to talk with the people here in particular, just to think out the responses that we have. I love what both Jeffrey and Noah said, because I don't have an answer in 3s, unfortunately. But what I like about so much is this idea of both the drought and the situation that has been created in terms of just the anxiety that's in society, and also from Noah, the idea of hardening targets. And what I would add is hardening targets, but not hardening hearts. And I think one of the most important, crucial ways in which we respond to anti-Semitism is to remember that we are part of a larger society in which there's multivalent kinds of people and different kinds of religion, and to meet them in our space as identified Jews, as proud, as open, and really feeling this sense of compassion, so of a co-pain, that the incidents of anti-Semitism are part of a larger social ill, as Jeffrey said, and that social ill infects and affects us all. And so part of what we need to do is really do some sort of not to think of us as in a comparative way, our pain is greater than your pain, but rather acknowledging that there are other communities that are equally in pain or are differently in pain, and to think about what our responses are to tragedies that happen sort of across different communities, particularly in Los Angeles, which is such a vast geographical region. So I was thinking about the response just this past week, and when I was reading about the shootings and worrying about my students who lived in the neighborhood and my friends who were in the neighborhood, I was remembering an opinion piece that was written right after the Tree of Life shooting in Pittsburgh, in which the author sort of articulated an astonishment that a Jewish community, a Jewish synagogue, was the target of a mass shooting. And that sense of complete bafflement that Jewish assimilation or Jewish success in the United States was not yet complete. And there was a response to that op-ed that reminded me of really the tensions that are in Jewish communities. In being another target, we were a target like the grocery store in Buffalo or the Walmart in Texas. In other words, as an immigrant group, we were othered, and at the same time, we were made victims of societal ill in the same regard. And I think one role that we have to play is to use the advantages that we have accomplished in the last 400 years to really to speak to the needs of other communities, even as we speak to the needs of our communities. And we can do that out of the roles that we know in Jewish life, out of gimilut chasadim, out of acts of loving kindness, out of tikkun olam, that what we need to do is think about the ways in which we can really not just protect our people, but protect all people, because we're not just the only victims, but we are also part of a larger societal ill. So one thing I would say is that the Jewish engagement with ideas of feeding the hungry, of clothing the naked, all those issues all the social justice issues that sometimes get pushed aside when we think only of security. We have to think of those kinds of social engagements as a form of our security, of engaging with our neighbors, of knowing who our friends are, who the people are around us, and of really increasing our visibility as friends, as allies, as people in the neighborhood, as people who are part of a larger multi-ethnic city that have a role and a voice, but also feel pain ourselves. And I think what happens in a situation is an issue becomes only a Jewish issue, or only a Black issue, or only an issue of the Latinx community. In fact, all of these issues are Jewish issues. And I think one role that we need to play in the public sphere is to be visible, is to increase our visibility, and to show that we are equally as engaged in the city when it affects us and when it affects other people. And another role I think we need to have is really to think about the comparative work that we do in our educational systems, to teach classes that speak to, there's so many, I will just say from my experience and in the undergraduate world, there are a lot of questions that people know how to ask or don't know how to ask, and they're looking for answers. And what we really need to do is to educate what Jewishness is, what Judaism is, who Jews are, and the way in which we are part of this larger civic engagement. So education, I would say, public visibility, and serving our neighborhoods.
Thank you, Leah.
Steve, can I just add one thing on top of this, if I may? So over the last several weeks, there's been, unfortunately, several tragedies, not just in the Jewish community, but also in the Asian American community.
Absolutely.
A few weeks ago, I actually, after the tragedy in Monterey Park, I took my entire team out to Monterey Park to meet with local elected officials, and we visited the location of the shooting. And it was incredibly powerful. And unfortunately, it was within time of tragedy, which is critically important to support each other during those times. But it was interesting. It was actually on week 3 that we visited, when it was a little quiet, when the immediate tragedy was gone, when the national media was gone. And those simple acts shouldn't only be in time of crisis, but when they do manifest, they're deeply meaningful. And I can also tell you that over the last several days, and I'm fairly certain that Rabbi Farkas had the same experience, the outreach that I received from other communities was much different and much more enhanced than it frankly has been in the past.
Yeah, I would.
And it really was something that was in this terrible, terrible situation. It really was something that filled me with, during a difficult week, a great amount of inspiration.
Thank you, Jeff. I appreciate that. Sarah, I want to take our conversation in a somewhat different direction, although playing off of what Leah and Noah and Jeff have also all commented on. The 21st century is already a very different experience for Americans and also for the Jewish community. And as someone who studies language, culture, and community, Sarah, I would welcome, what do you see as some of the elements that are driving these changes, and how do we sort of tie this back together to the issues we've just, in a sense, unpacked?
Yeah, well, one trend that is quite common right now in American society and beyond is polarization. And that's already been mentioned a bit. And I think that has had a huge impact on the Jewish community, racial, ethnic, political polarization. And that is driving, I think, a lot of the animus that we've been talking about, but also the work that's been going on in the Jewish community. And we do have relatively new organizations that have cropped up that are geared toward the political right or the political left, synagogues that are polarizing based on political orientation, people selecting their synagogues based on the political orientation of that congregation. But another trend that I want to point to is a trend to be concerned about work-life balance and self-care and a search for personal meaning. And I see this having a big impact on the Jewish community, where people don't just go to synagogue because that's what you do. They go to synagogue if they find it personally meaningful, and they do all sorts of other Jewish things as a way of enhancing their sense of personal meaning and identity. And so this idea of bricolage, or bringing things together from multiple places and making a coherent whole that is yourself. And so I just returned from a conference of Jewish leaders, and I found it so inspiring, learning about all the new initiatives that people are working on within the Jewish community and beyond, and especially using Jewish wisdom and traditional practices of Judaism for personal meaning. And so I found new initiatives in education and Jewish engagement, religious life, community, social justice, social services, and the arts in particular. I find inspiring a lot of new Jewish engagement around music and food, visual art, dance, language. Also, the JAFE movement, Jewish Outdoor Food and Environmental Education, is part of all that, and also part of culture and political engagement at the same time because of sustainability. And of course, the many ways of engaging with Israel are another way that people are both polarized and are expressing their own personally meaningful sense of Jewishness.
Thank you. That's an extraordinary list of sort of new directions and new outcomes, if you wish, which takes us back to you, Jeffrey, for a moment. When we think about outcomes, what might we look for as we sort of see the Jewish community moving forward, not only in fighting anti-Semitism, but in possibly building other kinds of coalitional relationships and seeking ways to educate both our community and others?
There had to be one instant when somebody was going to mess up, whether it was muted or not. So now we did it. So listen, education and coalition are really the key on both fronts. Often I speak about all the challenges that face the Jewish people and the rise of anti-Semitism, but within that is also the opportunity to do so much education, which is part of what we do in our schools, public schools, private schools. And one of the most important elements of education right now to frankly build the kind of society we want and the partnerships we want is in the area of Holocaust education. I mean, really, the numbers are staggering around how little knowledge most people, particularly most young people, have about Holocaust education. ADL, we're actually going to be launching a new campaign, which is Learn to Never Forget, so that people have the tools, Jewish and non-Jewish alike, to understand the roots, the ultimate horrible expressions of anti-Semitism. And with those tools, we're not born to hate, we learn to hate. So the hope is that we can unlearn to hate as well. The best way to do that is by knowing people. It's so simple, but yet so difficult, is by knowing your fellow human in different communities. And it's something that I know that, again, I'm so proud to say each and every time, in partnership with the Jewish Federation. We are working so hard on this right now within our community. And I know there are so many people listening right now, watching on this Zoom, who've dedicated so much time. But unfortunately, all too frequently, as a Jewish community, we have not worked together. And so we are working together so that we can build the partnerships with other communities, because we're all part of the same great city, but it does have those challenges. So we are very focused on that right now, because we recognize, particularly with this rise in anti-Semitism, and part of it's education at all levels. And so each of us have different programs and roles. One example is something we do at ADL, which is we're actually training LAPD patrol officers who are in largely Jewish areas about cultural awareness. So that's something that we want them to be more to, just as when the Federation, CSI, and NOAA, they do trainings for security personnel at synagogues and other Jewish institutions. Part of it's also to provide that cultural training. So it's a lot of work that we're engaged in right now. It's an opportunity. We're living in very challenging times, but within that challenge comes the opportunity. And if it's disruptive in a sense for us to work more together, more disruption ahead.
Noah and Sarah, as you know, and many on this webinar are familiar, the Los Angeles Jewish community has just experienced this very important research, the Jewish population study. And there's similar research being extended beyond LA across the country. And it's sharing some extraordinary important demographic information, generational trends, and other data points that I think are particularly significant for us in this conversation and beyond it. So I think it would be helpful for our audience to hear a bit about the findings. What have we learned here, and what might we apply here to some of the issues we are talking about? So I invite Noah and Sarah to open this part of our conversation.
Great. Thank you, Stephen, again, and happy to be joined by Sarah in this conversation. It's great. The landmark study of Jewish LA, which is all on the website studyofjewishla.org, has shown some just incredible things that are unique about LA, but I believe are trendsetters for the Jewish community. I'm going to give you just a few quick facts, okay? First of all, 50% of Jewish Angelenos have an immigrant living in their household, which is the idea that we've been around in America and that we are all white and white passing and that English is really our first language. It's just not, it's factually not true. Secondly, 19% of Jewish households here in LA are experiencing significant financial troubles, many of whom qualify for federal level of benefits, which means that we're certainly not all wealthy. In fact, our wealth patterns track very closely to other minority communities here in LA. And then thirdly, which I just want to put out there, is we are home to some of the largest ethnic diasporas in the world, including the Iranian American population, who has been particularly targeted this last week, and Russian and Ukrainian speaking American Jewish population, who has been targeted in one way or another since the war in Ukraine, and home to a massive Israeli American diaspora culture here in LA, who always get targeted when things flare up in Israel. We should also know that 10% of our Jewish community is Latino or Latinx, and that makes a very significant proportion, statistically significant proportion of who we are. So we are incredibly diverse. We are incredibly diverse economically, socially, ethnically, religiously. That is something that's very unique to us, but we see that those trend lines going up exponentially across the country. So I'll just leave that piece and then see if Sarah wants to add other trend lines coming out of the data.
Well, you touched on the main points that I thought of as well, but I'll just add that in Jewish communities, we can't just assume that most of the students will be Ashkenazi, and we can't just assume that most of the students will have two Jewish parents when we're talking about Jewish educational institutions, for example. And so that's another trend I want to point to is intermarriage. When we think about intermarriage, often Jewish professionals think it's something to try to prevent, but we can't say that anymore. It's a fact. It's just something that exists, and that Jewish communal organizations should just assume that many of the people who are going to be involved come from families with multiple heritages. And in fact, if we look at the data from Los Angeles, 57% of married Jews in LA are married to non-Jews. And another trend I want to point to is that denominations are less salient. And like you said, Noah, LA being on the cutting edge, a harbinger of what's to come in the country at large, is the rise in people who say they're just Jewish, who don't feel a commitment to a particular denomination. And along with that, we see an increased polarization between orthodoxy and others. And there is also a continuum there, right? There are conservadox, people who are kind of in between orthodoxy and non-orthodoxy, but that's something that we're going to be seeing, we're going to be hearing about a lot in the future, is the rise in the numbers, the percentage of the American Jewish community that identifies as Orthodox, especially as Hasidic. So, and another trend that I want to point to is pride, just that so many Jews are proud to be Jewish, and I expect that will continue to rise with this latest increase in anti-Semitism. I think a common response is fear and maybe staying home from things, but another common response is pride and wanting to engage in Jewish communities because people are targeting us and feeling like part of that group that is being targeted. We even see this in names. Stephen, you asked about studies, the LA Jewish population study and other studies, and I'll just bring in quickly my own study of Jewish names, where I found that there has been a major increase since the late 1960s in Jews who give their children distinctively Jewish names that are identifiably Jewish. And it remains to be seen how this latest rise in anti-Semitism will affect that. But I kind of assume that it will continue to rise, that people will continue to want to express their distinctiveness in the names that they give their children.
If I don't mind, if I just want to add one other statistic that I think is really important. It's not in the study, but it's something we all relate to if you're a Jewish person. There's 750,000 individuals living in Jewish households here in LA, making it the second largest Jewish community in the world, and the fourth largest in the world. There are actually more Jewish individuals living in LA than there are in Jerusalem, just to give you a sense of how big we are. Not a single one of them, if there are parents, would be willing to put their child in a Jewish school or preschool if there wasn't armed security out front. And that is a direct correlation and outcome of the kind of anti-Semitism that we're seeing today. That adds it significantly, and in my opinion, unfairly, to the burden and cost of expressing our First Amendment rights, our rights to assemble, our right to exercise our religion, and our right to pray, and our right to express ourselves. And I don't know if there are other minority groups that experience the same kind of fear that our community feels on a daily basis. And if they do, they too should be engaging with security. But I can certainly tell you there's not a single Jewish adult that would be willing to put their child in a preschool today if there wasn't an armed guard out front.
The study also points to the issue of anti-Semitism, as the data points from both the studies by ADL and the LA population study confirm a really heightened consideration or concern about the rise in anti-Semitism. I wanted to move us, Leah, to another piece of the story. As we know, this new century, we see a decline in some of our civic and religious institutions. In part, we've already described or discussed some of those factors. But we also are deeply concerned about a strong, viable, dynamic, democratic, and free society, which is dependent on really these kinds of institutions to carry us forward. So do we go about repairing them, or do we reinvent them? How do we sort of plan for this transitional moment where we know institutions are in crisis, but we also know our society requires a strong and democratic structure?
Thank you. I want to go back. I feel like I want to say a couple things and then I want to go forward. So I really appreciate the focus on education, because I think to me the insidiousness and the viciousness of the current anti-Semitism is largely in part it grew in, it's not only this, but it's grown in a vacuum, and the diversity that the population study shows us is part of the sort of the non-conformity to the projection. In other words, there's this projection of who the Jew is, or who an American Jew is, or what a Jew in Los Angeles looks like. And it's not, as Noah and Sarah said, doesn't it all correlate with the reality of who's Jewish in the world? And I think it's always interesting to me, and this is something that I love about being at USC, because it's such a diverse population. It's always interesting when people's projections are sort of blown up, not in a negative way, but in a way of like, oh, I didn't realize that Jews were also X, or Jews were also Y, or that Blacks are also X and Latinos are also Y. In other words, all these ways in which we pigeonhole people, sometimes it's not nefarious or malicious. It's just out of ignorance. And I think, Jeffrey, you pointed to this idea when your team going to Monterey Park, for instance. It's just and other people responding. When we really get to know one another, we do have a sense of what's possible across different ethnic groups, but we also need some in-reaching, right? We also need to teach our own people who is among us and who is part of our really diverse Jewish community. And I think that there is such an interesting moment of opportunity right now in 2023 to really teach each other who we actually are. And I mean that both within the Jewish community in Los Angeles and also much larger within Los Angeles, the community of Los Angeles. So Sarah, you talked about the conservadox, but there's this growing trend of people who are reformative or conservaform, these people who are sort of on the other side of in between reform and conservative, who don't maybe don't align with a certain denomination, but align with a religious leader or align with the community's priorities. And that to me is also an opportunity to reach through the community to help us learn. And Stephen, that sort of leads me to this question where you pose it as a binary. Either we build up the legacy institutions, or we scrap them, or and really just go for sort of startups. And as an intellectual historian and as a thought person, I take the long view on these things. I take the long view on American anti-Semitism. I take the long view on what it means to have sort of a legacy institution and what really the cyclical nature of the growth of the American Jewish community. So I would say neither or both. I would say I would reject the premise of the question, because to me, I think what startup culture has taught us is that the energy and the innovation of people who really want something new can feed into the legacy institution and not necessarily be competitive, but as two knives sharpen one another, as two students sharpen one another, they can really speak to the different needs of this very diverse community. So a very white federation, for instance, isn't necessarily going to speak to a not very white Jewish population, but different organizations that are really either pop up from within a certain community to speak to really respond to a specific need. It doesn't require, but we're obligated to be as respectful for the startup as we are to the legacy institution. And I think, the question is always, the issue is always going to be money, right? And this is where we come with a zero-sum mentality, that it's either build up the legacy and fix these. And by legacy, I mean, I'm with two leaders of two amazing legacy organizations here on this panel, the ADL and the Jewish Federation. These are longstanding community organizations that have really responded to crises and moments of peacefulness and of growth and of progressiveness. And I think when we take the energy and the innovation of different, I don't want to say startup, because there's also the drawback to the startup, that it's a flash in the pan, and with some concerns about fiscal responsibility. I think what we do is we find ways in which the larger community is not zero sum, but a both and. I call this the Benor doctrine. I've learned this from my friend Sarah Benor. It's not either or, but and, that we are really beneficiaries of a both and more social, religious, and organizational economy. And in thinking about how everybody can win, it's the and doctrine. And I love it because what it means is in helping a smaller organization that might target a place that the Federation can't reach, for instance, then what the Federation is doing is furthering the mission of developing Jewish pride and Jewish organizational responsibility and the kind of outreach that leads to the kind of education that I think the ADL is supportive of.
So I love that. I love the and. Thank you, Sarah, for creating or embellishing this notion, and to Leah for carrying it forward. So to two legacy leaders sitting before us, how do you see the future in terms of the roles that your respective agencies play, not only in the immediate challenges, but in some of the longer term questions that the population study suggests and that we know face American society in larger terms?
So both and more is a beautiful sentiment. And I speaking for my friend, Rabbi Farkas, I think we both embrace that. Some of the challenges, and really we have different organizations. I run the second largest region in the country of a national organization. But our organization is led by Jonathan Greenblatt, our CEO and national director. And so we as a legacy organization have been transformed in the last several years since 2017, when Jonathan joined us. We continue to innovate. We have no choice because those who seek to do us harm certainly are innovative. And so one of the things we embrace is innovation, partnership. We just brought J-Lens, which is active in the corporate space to root out anti-Semitism from the corporate investment landscape. We actually brought them in, and they're now part of ADL. So we try to find these opportunities to partnership because in many respects, because we're the legacy organizations like the Federation, is we also have longstanding relationships and reputations and the ability to be in certain tables because of that history. However, and again, this is really a testament. I'm so thankful. We should all be thankful that Rabbi Farkas is leading our Federation, because we're looking at things as partners. We don't all have the answers. I don't have all the answers at ADL. The Federation doesn't have all the answers. And there's plenty of organizations doing important work. But we have to recognize both and. And so sometimes it's a challenge, to go back to Leah, some of your comments. Historically, it's been a challenge, a perception of finite resource. Right now, the challenges that are in front of us are frankly too serious to have anything other than cooperation. And that's how we operate, because we must. And that's both with those of us who've been around for a long time and those startups, or whatever we want to call them, who are doing new and innovative things and reaching areas that sometimes it's harder for ADL or a Federation to. So, Noah?
Yeah, thank you, Jeffrey. I'll just add a couple of things here that I think are really important. History of Federation, what people think Federation still is, which we haven't been for a long time, is an umbrella beneficiary organization that would raise funds and then dole it out to agencies for unrestricted relief and sort of control those organizations. We haven't been that way for over a decade. My predecessor, Jay Sanderson, changed that model, I think, for the better. What we are now is not an umbrella, but a platform. And it's a platform for Jewish expression. Think of it as dozens of experiments in Jewish life, identity formation, community relations. And the partners that we have, so over 60 partners here in LA, a number of partners in Israel and abroad, they we work with them and we develop strategies with them, data-driven, impact-oriented strategies to try to move the ball forward on whatever the issue is in front of us, whether it's anti-Semitism, education, mental health, et cetera, whatever that issue is. And the future of Federation is actually to be incubating more of those experiments along the way. That's where I actually deny the sort of startup versus legacy framework at all, is because what we're able to do with a stable platform, the stable endowment, the stable amount of funding that we have, is to help inculcate, incubate new projects in Jewish life. And we don't have to take credit for a single one of them. We can take credit for the ability to create the environment for those organizations to thrive and for us to work together and collectively. But the Federation doesn't run the Jewish community. The Federation helps the Jewish community run. And if you take that framework as a new framework, there's no such thing as a legacy organization. We are simply a magnifier, amplifier, and force multiplier for other organizations here in town.
So there's a question that's emerged out of what Jeffrey and Noah have just spoken about to Sarah and to Leah. The Hebrew Union College is a legacy seminary. How do we reshape? How do we see it fit with some of the thinking that both of you have already talked about, but also that we've just heard from Noah and from Jeffrey in terms of how they sort of see their institutions evolving and shifting?
Well, one great innovation at HUC is the Jewish Innovation Fellowship, which is given to young change makers who have an idea and they want to implement it. And I would love to see that model replicated beyond HUC, maybe by Federation or Jewish Community Foundation. If someone has an idea and they're not part of a 501c3 nonprofit organization, it's very hard for them to get funding. Even if they are part of a 501c3, most grants from family foundations are by invitation only. And so I would love to see a new trend in Jewish philanthropy that kind of levels the playing field a little bit and gives more opportunities to people, not just young people, but people who have an idea that can be innovative in the Jewish community. And also at HUC, the Zelikow School of Jewish Nonprofit Management is all about entrepreneurship and engagement in new ideas. And our curriculum is geared around people who have an idea and giving them the tools they need to implement that idea in the world. So I'd love to see more of that in general. I think HUC is a terrific example of a legacy institution as sort of a big cruise liner trying to figure out how to be nimble like a tugboat. And I think in the Zelikow School is a really good example of what that means. One of the it's hard to even talk about it in terms of a blessing, but one of a good thing that might have come out of COVID or the time in which we were really separated from one another is how we reached through the screen to one another. And so one thing that HUC did that I thought was really incredible was in bringing its faculty together in ways that it had never done before. These 4 different campuses really did create a sort of a central identity of what the college could and should and ought to be. And one way that we were able to sort of manifest that was through programs like the Zelikow School and also through the School of Education, in which the new programs developed, so that we had students from Israel Zooming in and students from Poland Zooming in and students from a variety of other places that normally would never be able to interact or engage with the kind of learning and the kind of training that places like the Zelikow School and the School of Education do. And that's, I think, a terrific benefit in much the same way that new forms of liturgy were also created by rabbinical students and by our rabbinical colleagues, of creating new, not just literally new prayers for new kinds of experiences that we all engaged in over the course of the last 3 years, but also innovative prayer services and the like. And I think it's been really amazing to see. I would say that one thing that I have loved about HUC in its reinvention of self, or its continued reinvention of self, is that
to borrow a phrase from another tradition, the sacred cows are really being examined. And that is a very painful process. And it can be excruciating in terms of what the analysis shows. But I think, and again, the long view in re-examining what works and what doesn't work, and then thinking about ways that we could bolster, sort of speaks to the kind of innovation that Noah's talking about, and really the tension that doesn't have to be tense in the sort of the more is more doctrine. What is it that we can share with one another? Where are we weak, and where can we reach out to be stronger with somebody else? Where can we bolster? And what ways can we, just to borrow Noah's term, be a platform for the kinds of Jewish intellectual leaders that are going to further change the social, the religious, the political economy in which the Jewish community operates? And I think that's LA is particularly a benefit of this, is a beneficiary of this kind of innovative work. And I think in the kind of outreach that we're doing, I spent 2 years on an incredible committee that USC put together for the engagement of Jewish life. It was called the Jewish Life Advisory Committee. And it brought people in from ADL, and it brought people in from the Fed, it brought people from AJC, and it brought people from within the university and outside of the university to really examine the way in which students and staff members and the university were promoting by accident, unintentionally, stereotypes or microaggressions, or the ways in which the systemic understanding of who Jewish students are and what they need, or how people understand Judaism, that kind of examining, it was incredibly painful. But yet it's, I think, created an opportunity for new kinds of growth that I think even pre-COVID, we wouldn't have been able to do.
Thank you. One of the questioners has asked if we would post, for example, Noah and Sarah, the Jewish population study. They are interested in looking deeper into that research. So if we can provide that in the chat room, that would be great. We invite the audience to share questions. And as we do, I want to take us to another area for a moment. And Sarah, I'm going to start with you. I wanted to focus on the fact that we've been talking about the macro all along, the large social, political issues of our society. And I thought we should talk for a few moments about the more micro factors, about what's driving people. What are the factors that are influencing change? What are the issues that people are facing in terms of technology and the upheavals of the economic scene and effects of the pandemic? So how do we see this playing out on the human condition and on the lives of people? I think in one of your earlier comments, Sarah, you did reference the fact of the wellness issue or the general health of people as a primary concern. And you may want to go deeper into some of these considerations about where we start from the individual. And I think Jeffrey and Noah would concur with this observation that what we saw acting out here in Los Angeles this week of a one actor, what we worry about are these sort of lone rangers whose behaviors at times, in a sense, out of frustration, anger, mental health crises are in a sense creating the conflicts and the tensions on the ground.
Well, I think that is a huge question. I think I'd like to hear what Jeffrey and Noah have to say about that one, because I think that's something that they're dealing with on a day-to-day basis and in a very effective way.
So let's just take as the example the shooter over the past week. We don't know much. What we know is in the charging document that's filed in federal court. But some of the factors seem to be at play. So, for example, the turmoil in one's life. In the charging documents reported that the shooter had been homeless and living in his car for at least a year. It's been reported that he one time was in dental school and had been dismissed from dental school. Presumably that caused some economic uncertainty. So you see these real factors and they come to life. You then go and also looking at this individual in the charging document, it talks about how the person had a real demonstrated animus towards Jews, had directed a series of text messages towards a former classmate, and also had blamed COVID on Persian Jews and shared a flyer. This is a flyer that's used widely by an extremist group of anti-Semites, distributed throughout the country. Frankly, it may have been left in the driveway of some of the people watching today. Now, this isn't to say that the individual was an adherent of this group. We don't know. But at the very least, we know that he had access to this flyer, which he then shared. So you see these kind of factors that are going on in people's lives, and they have this contributing factor. So that's just but one example, and you know, without a great deal of detail and knowledge yet, but it does have some of the elements that we've been talking about.
I'll just want to add, I mean, Jeffrey's 100% right. And we know that what trauma and the insecurity of modernity does to the human condition, and that in the face of that insecurity, without having an overriding narrative about what your life is supposed to be about, you start to write your own. And for some people, that's really empowering. And for other people, that's terrifying. And that the way they try to gain control is by committing acts of control. Acts of violence, rape, assault, etc. And we also know that Jews historically have been scapegoats for those very feelings historically, whether it's religious feelings, racial feelings, ethnic feelings, socioeconomic feelings. Jews have always been the butt of those types of assaults, and including this past week. So part of our job as Federation, I think part of the job of any university, including Hebrew Union College, is to really invest in building the civic fabric of the democracy in which we find ourselves. And that means doubling, tripling our investment in interfaith community relations. That means creating policies that lift people out of poverty and fighting for those policies from our government. That is to help create a narrative that people feel drawn to, that's positive and self-fulfilling and self-actuating. And that's the joy piece of what I was referring to earlier. And our zone of control is only so big, but as long as we're doing that within our zone of control, then we've done what we needed to do for our time here as leaders, as organizations, and as institutions. What's beyond our zone of control, we can try to influence, but we have to admit that we are a very small people amongst a huge population, and there are forces of gravity that are just so much stronger than what any one of us can muster.
And I'll just add, Stephen, you asked about technological change, and I mean this relates to anti-Semitism when we're thinking about the rise of social media and extremism on social media. And I want just to remind us that the internet and social media, Instagram, TikTok, et cetera, can also be great forces for good in the Jewish community in particular. And just thinking back to earlier in our conversation when we were talking about new forms of engagement, I think this is a way that some people do Jewish, and especially among young people, seeing TikTok videos of Jewish things and learning Jewish things on TikTok is a huge part now of how people do Jewish. And so I do think that's something that we should foster within our Jewish organizations.
And that also, just to add one point, that comes into the policy of how you address the internet. So one of the things that's the typical target is Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. If you can't tell, I was a lawyer, so I actually litigated over this particular statute. We're not at ADL calling for the repeal of Section 230. We're calling for it to be reformulated, to be revised, because in many ways it is the backbone of the internet, and to simply get rid of it and not having something in its stead could make it even worse. So we all have to be very careful in what we're asking for and how we both modify the dangers that the internet prevents. Think of it like seatbelts on a car. Of course you have seatbelts. That's a step taken to add some measure of security. It doesn't mean we got rid of cars. And the same too with social media.
And I'll just add one more thing. It's really important. Community relations is based on proximity. And so in the 60s and 70s, proximity meant driving down or driving over to a church, a synagogue, a mosque, a Mason hall, or what have you, to be close to people. in the 90s and early 2000s, that might have been a shopping mall, that might have been other civic environments. Today, that is almost entirely online. If we don't have a Jewish presence on TikTok, on Facebook, on Snapchat, and on Instagram, then we're already way behind. And I'll just go even further. If we don't have a Jewish presence on Discord and Twitch, which is where the next generation are showing up as watching people play video games and all of that, then we are way behind. And so I would just really encourage us to keep pushing the envelope of proximity and doing the skills of community relations don't change. The venues in which we express them do change. And so that's just a matter of re-entering those and entering maybe the first time those places.
And I would say, just to tag on there, I know this isn't my question, but I have an opinion, which is to say that we need to call things out. We can't be silent. We can't have the old, very old version of a hush hush campaign. We have to, because of the nature of social media and the way that people pile on, we have to be upfront and out there in order to clarify the narrative that is the compassionate narrative, that's the accurate narrative, that's the comparative when it needs to be comparative, or the particular when it needs to be particular. And all the spaces, Noah, that you just mentioned, there's also all the other sort of non-social media spaces in which we also have to be articulate. And I think even if we don't agree, we still need to call it out in the ways in which we need to call it out. So I was at a birthday party yesterday, and the conversation went to a movie that plays with a lot of stereotypes. And one of the parents thought it was funny and wasn't concerned. And 4 of the other parents piled onto that one parent to say, actually, it was profoundly uncomfortable. And for me, it was the best conversation I've ever had at a birthday party. And all the 9 years that I've been going to birthday parties, because it was really my stuff. But what I thought was so interesting is that there was a complete willingness, A, to engage on whether it was dwelling in stereotypes, and B, a willingness to articulate different points of view in a public sphere. So this one said, oh, there was an article in Tablet about it. And this one said, I read the piece in the Washington Post. And what that meant was that the level of public discourse was available for the kinds of education that we're all talking about. And I really feel strongly about making sure that our kids, our high school students, our college students have this, both the confidence in being able to articulate kinds of points of view, but also have the skills in order to have that kind of level of conversation. It doesn't have to be debate, but they can hear a point of view and they can respond to a point of view and think really about what it means to dwell in prejudices or simply to be education. So I would say, in addition to being there, is having really the wherewithal to speak it out.
We're getting an interesting pushback from someone in our audience who has suggested that we are talking a kind of collaborative language. Yet the American Jewish community, this person suggests, is highly siloed, highly competitive. How do we create this kind of dialogue and these kinds of inter-institutional behaviors in other frames of the Jewish community in ways that make the community more integrative, if you wish?
Yeah, that's entirely my mission.
Yeah. Okay.
By the time I retire, whenever that is, I hope to have some kind of impact on that very question. The person who's doing the pushback is exactly right about where things stand today. But I think we talk a lot about how siloed we are, and we don't do much to try to attack the silo nature, the balkanization of the Jewish community. And I think it's the Federation's mission and job as part of creating a flourishing Jewish community is to at least attempt that conversation. And it may be to bridge political divides, but it's also, again, we are so diverse here in LA that we don't understand what matters to a Persian Jew might be completely the opposite of what matters to a Russian-speaking or Ukrainian-speaking Jew, which might be completely the opposite to what matters to an Israeli-American Jew. And so it's not just about observance. It's not just about movements anymore. In fact, as you know, less than 50% of Angelenos, according to the study, at this point, ascribe themselves to a major movement of Jewish life. And so we have to reorganize. And that's a political skill. as much as anything else. And the only organization in town, in my opinion, who has the capacity to even begin this conversation is the Federation. And it's an area we want to move into in the next couple of years.
Noah, I'm so glad that you feel that way. And I think that's exactly the role of the federations. It's also the role of individual organizations. I think about the Jewish nonprofit world as an ecosystem where different parts affect other parts. And it only works when we're all working together. And we have overlapping missions. Why not find that area of overlap and work together in that area of overlap? I run a very small Jewish initiative at HUC called the Jewish Language Project. And we've already, since launching in 2020, we've already collaborated with 77 organizations. And I think that can be a model for other organizations, that cooperation leads to more. Like Leah was saying, more is more, right? The more you can get done with other people, the more gets done. You know, if we all have overlap in mission, if that whatever we can do to get there is helpful, and collaboration can really make people feel good about the work that they're doing, but also get more done.
There is a paradigm shift, and we're at the beginning of it in the Los Angeles Jewish community.
That's right.
There's no question about it. It's tangible. And it's unlike most other communities in this country, unfortunately. And so for those of you who are watching tonight, who've had this frustration for years, as I have, I've been running ADL here in Los Angeles for 2.5 years. Before that, I was a volunteer leader, a number of boards, as Steve laid out. It was my great frustration. And I want to assure each and every one of you that we are at the beginning of a paradigm shift in this city. It's led by Noah. I'm proud to be his partner in this work. We're moving in this direction. We're not there yet. We're going to make some mistakes at times, folks. But I do want to assure you it's happening. And it's enormously gratifying. But we need everyone's help and the spirit of cooperation. We have to work together, but we need all of you to help us work together, because we're doing it already. So
we have an interesting question about cancel culture.
Wait,
Leah.
can I say one thing, Stephen?
Sure.
I'm sorry. I like cancel culture. I mean, I don't like it, but I want to talk about it. But what I want to say also, that we have the luxury in LA of being siloed, whereas in other parts of the country, there's just smaller communities who don't have just the plethora of options. And, the 2 shuls you don't want to go to, and the 3 shoes that sometimes you will go to. So I think there is, I appreciate that pushback about the siloing. And I do think that it's really, there's something interesting about these large urban Jewish communities. But I see my HUC students going to these tiny little communities in nowhere, Texas, or in northern Alaska, and they're the one Jewish leader there's lots of lay leaders, but they're the one clerical leader. And those people are hungry for those communities are hungry for other kinds of engagement, other kinds of education, largely because they are frontal they're the Jews of, there's the one Jew in X place, or the 5 Jews or the 10 Jews. And I think there is something about, there can be an LA syndrome of thinking that we're like everybody else, but there is something very unique about LA Jewish community that I appreciate and love. But I would say in the larger Jewish community across America, it's not quite the same. It's not quite as siloed, because the privileges or the luxury of being siloed isn't there. Cancel away, Stephen. Sorry.
That's right. The question on cancel culture, the audience, I think, is concerned that they see their students, their college students, their high school students, in a sense, facing a very difficult time in terms of expressing a pro-Israel position, expressing a particular viewpoint about being Jewish and involved in whether it's the feminist movement or some other causes, even the environmental cause, or even in gay and lesbian causes, where the Jewish perspective is somehow discounted and marginalized. So how do we help our young folks manage through this environment where they're, in a sense, being canceled out?
The first thing I'll add, but there's plenty of people here can answer this question probably better than me, is I just want to be clear that cancel culture is not a phenomenon only of the left. It is certainly a phenomenon of the right. I think we even had someone try to cancel M&Ms on us right before the Super Bowl. So like it is a phenomenon usually used as a tool for some other purpose, right? Like whether people are going to make money off of cancel culture, or they gain political power off of cancel culture, or they get more likes and follows on their social media because they're trying to cancel. So there is a lot out there that drives cancel culture, and it's not just one political perspective. I do want to say, and I think other people can answer this the more erudite view than I have, is that we can't cancel culture at this point. It's part of society. We can hopefully overcome it if we really push for it. So we have to develop resiliency. And I think that's one of the jobs that Hillel does a very good job at, is trying to give resiliency to Jewish students on campus. But I'll leave it to the two campus professors and Jeff maybe to help me answer that question.
So I'll just jump in. Our CO at ADL, Jonathan Greenblatt, often says we practice counsel culture, not cancel culture. Now, this is particularly when you see prominent people, prominent companies say something. And it could be anyone from a Nick Cannon to a Kyrie Irving. And then let's throw in Ye, formerly known as Kanye West. We adopt that principle of counsel culture versus cancel culture whenever possible. Now, the possibility is the key, because the question is, and we're talking adults here, we're talking prominent people here, are they willing to learn? Do they have the grace to grow and learn? What we've seen, for example, in that sphere is some are unrepentant and keep double and triple and quadrupling down like a Ye, Kanye West. Some who early indicated that they were willing to grow and learn, like a Kyrie Irving, but that then shifted very quickly. Or someone, frankly, like Nick Cannon, who Jonathan Greenblatt now does a podcast with, because it's an opportunity to counsel. Now, when we come to the campuses, the hope is that in many ways you can use that same approach, is that rather than being canceled or trying to cancel, that you engage in counsel. And counsel is really just a form of education, wherever possible. Hopefully in person, face-to-face. Social media online is a terrible place to try to actually engage in a meaningful dialogue. So each environment, I think, has its own challenges, but in each, where you have the opportunity to engage in counsel rather than cancel, and then I think you need to try to adapt the same, which is, if you're the one being canceled, do you have a chance to counsel your way out of it, in a sense? But Sarah, Leah, you're the ones dealing with it on campus day to day.
Well, I love that distinction between cancel and counsel. And I want to just add, when we think about what Jewish wisdom can provide, in this case, I think the concept of tshuva is useful. And I've seen that a lot in the discourses around people's missteps and the cancel culture that comes out of that. But so I think if we think about tshuva as a way forward, and if we lay out a way that an individual who makes comments that are offensive can do tshuva, then I think that will be a contribution to the world.
So I have a different perspective. And I think it's because I think there's a difference between celebrity counsel and the individuals, and just pure networks and peer groups and smaller, less prominent places. There was a terribly painful and traumatic experience of the student president at USC being literally canceled. And that was, it was awful for the community. And you can counsel all you want, but the pain is still there. And I think it's important, yes, to build resiliency, as Noah says, but I also think that it's really beholden, we're beholden as sort of the adults in the room, but also as the legacy institutions and even the startup institutions, to help find a network, or a netting to support the people who are really at the front lines of what it means in smaller groups being canceled. And I think that it's really crucial that we as a community create and propagate ways in which we can help our young people who are victims, who try to say something, who are booed or are shouted down, either social media or physically in a real space, to give them both the sort of counseling that they need, right? Just the sort of nurturing that they need, having been the victim of that kind of situation, but also giving them other ways that they can think about how to, keep their messages correct and not feel gaslit in any particular way, but also maintain a sort of a voice. We really need to be clear, I think, as a community, what the resources are for people who feel that they've been completely canceled in that regard, in the small and the micro kind of way, and what kinds of support we can offer them, who they might go to have the different kinds of backup that they need in the support. I mean, I think it's a great question because it forces us to think in a very specific kind of, these are the 6 strategies to respond. If you're in a public high school and you say something that's pro-Israel and you're in a group of people who are anti-Israel, you might not be in the position to counsel them. You might only be in the position of trying to keep yourself really your personal safety protected, and then also like your role in the social fabric of that environment. And so I would love to see us develop much more specific plans and articulate not talking points necessarily, but strategies for young people. I'm going to really 40 and younger is what I'm really going to be generous in my understanding of youth there, of how to talk about different kinds of very complicated notions. Because what I have found from my students is that they know what they know, and then they run out of backup, either because of panic or because they don't have the larger context, or that they're making a specific point in a specific environment, but then the larger view isn't available for them. So I very much appreciate that question, and I think it is an issue on the local level, and I think it would behoove us to come up with really specific strategies.
I want to thank all of you, all 4 of you, and our audience for this extraordinary conversation. I could spend the rest of the evening hearing from each of you, learning from each of you, and thanking each of you for taking the time to offer your wisdom and insights, and also to give a sense of calm and focus and direction to our community, especially at this moment. If you want more details about tomorrow's gathering at EULA, you may want to check with the Federation and the ADL about the details tomorrow evening at 5:30 at EULA. And also, if you are interested in the LA Jewish Population Study, to take this opportunity to go and take a look at that, both at the Federation website and certainly through Brandeis Cohen Center's website. To my 2 colleagues at HUC, your extraordinary wisdom always is amazing and wonderful, and I'm so appreciative of what you offer to our students and to your colleagues, including myself. And to Jeffrey for your leadership at the ADL, and for really carrying forward the banner of this historic institution. And to Noah, taking on the challenge, a true challenge of reinventing and recreating a federation model that is, as you defined, a platform for innovation and bringing the community together. And I thank each of you and have a great evening. And I turn this back over to the Associate Director of the Casden Center. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you.
For moderating today's important conversation on the impact of the new anti-Semitism on Jewish behaviors and beliefs. Throughout the range of perspectives presented by our panelists, we clearly observe the powerful impact that anti-Semitism continues to have on the American Jewish community and how we can respond in meaningful and effective ways. I wish to thank our fantastic panelists, Sarah, Jeff, Noah, and Leah, for their insightful perspectives, and I thank the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion, Los Angeles, for partnering with the USC Casden Institute to bring you today's program. Finally, thank you to our audience for joining us today. I hope that you will continue to join us at future Casden events, including our next virtual event on Sunday, March 5th, titled Waves Apart, A Hidden History of Anti-Semitism in California Surf Culture. If you are not already on our mailing list, please join to receive information on our upcoming events. And on that note, I wish you all a wonderful evening.